Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1 of On the Nature of the Gods, Cicero is going to have the Epicurean Velleius present the Epicurean position on that very topic, the nature of the gods. He discusses whether they exist or not and provides an argument. After that, he tells us about a number of important features, we could say, of the divine or of the gods or God from the Epicurean position. And the first thing that he's going to talk about is that not only do we have a preconception that leads to understanding that the gods exist, because everybody has this, but the preconception is a little bit more fleshed out, and it turns out to be exactly the first line of Epicurus's principal doctrine, sovereign maxims, however you want to translate it, a text that we actually do have. And it tells us that the preconception is that the gods are blessed, beatos in Latin, and that they are also immortal or eternal. Both of these terms are used in that section. And so this is something that everybody has within their notion of God, which is born within us, according to the Epicureans and Epicurus himself. So he tells us nature which bestowed upon us an idea of the gods themselves, engraved on our minds the belief they're eternal and blessed. If this is so, the famous maxim of Epicurus truthfully enunciates that which is blessed and eternal can neither, now notice there's more to this, know trouble itself, nor cause trouble to another, and accordingly cannot feel anger or favor, since all things belong only to the weak. So we can, cull out some additional implications from this. If that's the case, then the gods are deserving of, as he's going to call it, pious worship. But we don't have to have any fear of the divine power or especially divine anger. And he's saying this because many people in his own time do fear the anger of the gods, or even the fact that they are powerful. So that's the first part of the gods' nature that is going to be argued for, and it's being argued for on the basis of preconceptions. And then he says the mind tries to strengthen or confirm, confirmandum, this belief, this opinio, by trying to discover the forma of God, the mode of his activity, it's translated, the action, actionem of life, and the operation, agitatio, of its mind or intelligence. So we want to go further and understand the gods better. So he begins by talking about the form. What does God appear like? And he says that for the divine form, we have hints of nature supplemented by teachings of reason. So two different arguments here. So preconceptions, the preconceptions shared by all human beings because nature itself stamps them on our minds. He says all human beings of all races, omnium gentium, derive the notion of gods as having human shape and none other. For in what other shape do they ever appear to anyone awake or asleep? So, when there's a theophany in real life, we could say it's always appearing as a human being or something like a human being. In dreams, the same sort of story. And he says, okay, that's fine, but not to make these primary concepts, primas notiones, the sole test of all things. Reason tells us the same thing. So we can make a more rational argument, and that is what he's going to do here. So what is the argument? The most excellent being, praestantissimum, would be, because of its happiness or eternity, the most beautiful. So, we could imagine beauty in a lot of forms, and he goes on to say, what disposition of the limbs, what cast of features, what shape or outline can be more beautiful than the human form? And this is quite interesting because it's not just the Epicureans, or at least Cicero's reconstruction of the Epicureans, who say stuff like this. We can find thinkers throughout the centuries claiming something special about the human form, that it is not just most beautiful to us, but most beautiful in itself. And how would we get to that? Well, we're going to see that there's, sort of a utility of design displayed in all parts of the human figure. Sometimes it's like, we stand erect, we can see further. But then there's going to be another argument that's provided here, which is quite interesting. The gods are supremely happy. So, if they're going to be happy, what does happiness require? So we get an argument here. No one can be happy without virtue. So happiness requires virtue. And then, what does virtue in its turn require? I mean, in a certain sense, if we want to speak very broadly, anything can have its virtue, its strength or excellence. But what they mean here is moral virtue, the things that we call courage or justice or temperance or wisdom. So what does that require? Can animals have those? Not according to a lot of ancient philosophers, including the Epicureans. So that requires reason, ratio, the kind of mental faculties that we have. So the gods, by this argument, must be happy because they have virtue. Virtue requires reason. These presumably are superlative in them. And now here's where the argument gets quite interesting. In what kinds of forms do we find rationality or reason? He says, reason is only found in the human shape, so it follows that the gods possess the form of human beings. Now, that's going to raise a kind of problem, as we're going to get to, but we should pause and think about that for a moment. So we're saying that the gods who we are trying to reason about because we don't know fully what they are, and there's some matter of dispute, they must have this form because this is the only form in which we human beings find rationality. So therefore, they must have human forms. So let's say we accept that. Then you could say, well, wait a second, then how are they different from us human beings? Are they just like super powerful or something along those lines? And Epicurus is going to say, well, no, they're not made out of the same substance as we are. He says their form is not corporeal, but only resembles bodily substance, quasi-corpus. They don't have blood, but just something like blood, quasi-sanguinem, right? And then he's going to go on to explain a bit, and he says that the substance and nature of the gods is such that in the first place it is perceived not by the senses, but by the mind, and not materially or individually like solid objects that we see, but by our perceiving images, owing to their similarity and succession
because an endless train of precisely similar images arises from the innumerable atoms and streams towards the gods. Our mind fixes its gaze on these images and attains an understanding, intelligentsia, of the nature of a being blessed and eternal. So, what does that mean? We don't actually see the gods. We cognize them in some way because they don't have bodies, but they have kinda or similar to bodies. Quasi is the term that's being used there. He also invokes another, presumably orthodox Epicurean idea called isonomia, uniform distribution. And what this means is that, throughout the universe, the vast universe, there should be a similar proportion between sorts of things. And since he says if the whole number of mortals is so many, there must exist no less a number of immortals, right? So that means that the gods must be as numerous as human beings are or have been. And then he adds, if the causes of destruction are beyond count, innumerabilia, then those that conserve, those that keep things into being are also bound to be infinite. Now, this is a little bit of a strange thing, because what he's going to say after this is that the gods aren't actually causes of destruction or of conservation. So why is he bringing that in? It seems like an afterthought, perhaps, which would pertain to the domain of nature. So we'll think about that a bit more in a bit. What about the gods' activity? Now, this is kind of interesting. Do the gods have activity? No, they don't have any activity at all. That's why they're blessed. They don't bother with these human affairs or the universe, and that's why they have such a good time, in their eternity, in their immortality. He says, you Stoics are fond of asking us what is the mode of life of the gods, how they pass their days. The answer is their life is the happiest conceivable, the one most bountifully furnished with all good things. Why? Because they're totally inactive. Nihil enim agit. They don't do a thing, right? They don't have any occupations. Nullis occupationibus est implicatus. They're not bound up with any sort of tasks. They don't have to-do lists. They don't worry about how things are going in the universe. They don't do any work. Nulla opera molitor, right? So they don't have any labor or toil, or however you want to translate opera. So what do? They just enjoy their own wisdom and virtue. Gaudet is the term there. They take joy in those two things, and they know with absolute certainty they will always enjoy pleasures that are everlasting and great. In maximus tum in aeternitas voluptatibus. So, pleasant sensations, we could say. So, gods are happy all the time. And he goes on and he'll talk about tranquility. That's translated here as tranquility. And this is the Epicurean point of view. What is it to have a really good life, to not be bothered by things? So he says that the good life, the happy life, consists in tranquility of mind, animi securitate. So it's not just not being bothered, but in knowing that things are going to be fine for you, no matter what happens, in part because nothing can happen to the gods. And also in, as it's translated here, entire exemption from all duties. Et in omnium vacatione munerum. And it's interesting there because that's the word that we actually derive much later on, vacation from, right? A vacancy, a not being occupied with anything. That's, again, why the gods are so blessed or happy. So then he's going to criticize the Stoics, and we'll look at the criticisms of the Stoics elsewhere. The key idea there that's being put forward is that the gods are not concerned with the governance of the universe, nor are they involved with its creation. Nature, as he's going to say, produces the world, the globe that we live on, right? But it doesn't just produce this world, it actually produces worlds, we could say, without number. And this is another Epicurean point of view. There's a multiplicity of worlds. So he says, if you would just contemplate the measureless and boundless extent of space that stretches in every direction, into which when the mind projects and propels itself, it journeys onward far and wide without ever sighting any margin or ultimate point where it can stop. In the immensity of length and breadth and height, there flits an immense quantity of atoms, innumerable, right? And this is the Epicurean physics, we would say, or cosmology. So everything is just created by nature, including the gods, presumably, although they are eternal, they are immortal, nothing ever happens to them, and they're not in charge of anything. So once again, this is why the gods can enjoy themselves so much. And there is a very interesting thing that's going to be said at the very end of Velleius's discourse here. He tells us that not only has Epicurus set us free from superstitious terrors, so we don't have any fear of beings who don't create trouble for themselves and seek to cause none to others, the gods, right? We worship, he says, with pious reverence. So, pia sanctaeque colimus, who are we worshiping? Well, he's already said earlier we worship the gods. We don't worry about them, but we can show them worship. We also do that with nature itself. Here it's translated as the transcendent majesty of nature, but if we want to be closer to the text, we worship nature, naturam, which excels and exceeds everything else, excellentium atque praestantem. So, nature which is better, greater than everything else, including the gods. The gods are great, wonderful, kind of models for what the good life would be for the Epicurean, just not being bothered with anything, don't get involved in politics or squabbles or worries about things. But nature as a totality does its own thing, and we can also worship that. Now, how did the Epicureans typically do that? Did they have shrines to nature? No, they engaged in natural philosophy, and that was part of their enjoyment, whether in the original Epicurean garden or in their various associations outside of it as through the centuries, Epicureanism spread. So this is the Epicurean understanding of the nature of the gods, not only presented, but also argued for in Book 1 of Cicero's work on the nature of the gods. So we're really looking at one of the central topics here. How do the Epicureans understand this? Here is precisely what they think the gods' shape and life is like.